My daughter pressed the folded paper into my palm right there in the church aisle, as if she were passing me a tissue. Her lips barely moved when she said it. Sign or leave. Not please, not mom, not even a glance at the baby in lace and white who was about to be baptized. Just those 3 words, sharp as a nail, delivered while people smiled and the organ breathed softly behind us. I was 72, and I had dressed carefully for that morning. A plain gray coat, a small gold cross on a chain, my hair pinned the way it always behaves when I ask it to. I'd told myself it mattered. I'd told myself that if I came quietly, if I didn't bring old arguments with me, maybe we could be a family for 1 hour without bitterness. I'd brought a little envelope with cash for the priest's donation and another one for my grandson, tucked deep in my handbag like something fragile. The church smelled of wax and cold stone. The font had been polished so it caught the light. My grandson, Oliver, slept with his mouth open against my daughter's shoulder, unaware of the grown-up games being played above his head. My daughter, Rachel, looked beautiful in that tense, polished way some women wear like armor. Beside her stood her husband, Grant, hands folded, eyes scanning the room as if he owned it. No one else seemed to notice the paper in my hand. People were greeting each other, whispering about the baby's cheeks, adjusting scarves. I opened the fold slowly, because I have lived long enough to understand that rushing is how you miss the trap. At first glance, it looked official. Typed lines, a place for initials on the bottom, my name printed neatly as if the machine knew me better than my own child did. I read it once, then again, because my mind refused to accept it on the first pass. It was an agreement, an arrangement, the kind of word people use when they want theft to sound clean. It said I was transferring my house into Rachel's name, effective immediately, and authorizing Grant as my financial representative for certain accounts. It mentioned safety, simplifying matters, future care. It was dressed up in polite language, but the bones of it were bare. Give us what you have, or you don't belong here. My fingers went numb around the paper. I could hear the priest's quiet instructions to the godparents, could hear a baby fuss somewhere behind me, could hear the muffled cough of an old man who had sat in that same pew for years. Everything continued as normal. Only my world had shifted. Rachel leaned in closer, still smiling at the room. "We don't have time," she murmured. Her nails were pale pink, perfectly filed. Grant's lawyer said it's easiest this way. If you make a scene, people will remember you for the wrong reason. For the wrong reason, as if I had ever been remembered for the right one. I looked at Grant. He didn't look back. He kept his eyes forward, jaw tight, like he was waiting out bad weather. That told me more than any sentence on that page. This wasn't a moment of panic. This was planned. "You want me to sign this?" I said, and my voice sounded steady even to me. Rachel's smile didn't change. "Yes. And if I don't?" Her eyes flicked to the door, then back to the font. "Then you can go." I thought of my kitchen window at home, the one I replaced myself after my husband died because no one came when I asked. I thought of the property taxes I never missed, the repairs I paid for, the quiet pride of having something that was mine without asking permission. I thought of the way Rachel had started calling less once she married Grant, how every visit turned into a list of needs, how affection always came with paperwork now. The priest lifted his hands and began the blessing. People turned toward the front. This was the last moment before the ceremony began in full, before there would be no pause without eyes on us. I took the pen from my handbag. The cap clicked off loud in my ears. My hand didn't shake. That surprised me. But age does that sometimes. It drains the unnecessary drama out of you and leaves only the essential. I signed my name where it asked, in the same handwriting I used on checks, on birthday cards, on my husband's death certificate. Then I folded the paper neatly back along its crease, as if returning it to its proper place. Rachel held out her hand, already relieved. I placed the document into her palm, but I didn't let go right away. I met her eyes at last. "In front of everyone," I said softly, so only she could hear. "All right." Then I let go, stepped back into the pew, and sat down with my hands folded, facing the font as the priest continued, as if nothing at all had happened. I sat through the rest of the christening with my back straight and my face calm, the way you learn to do when you've swallowed something sharp and don't want anyone to see you choke. The priest's voice flowed over us, gentle and practiced. Water touched my grandson's forehead, and he startled, then settled again, his tiny hand curling as if around an invisible promise. People smiled. Someone dabbed their eyes. I did neither. From the outside, I must have looked like a proud grandmother, quiet and composed. Inside, I was cataloging details the way I always do when something important happens. The weight of the pen still lingered in my fingers. The exact phrasing of the document replayed itself in my head, line by line. I noticed how quickly Rachel had folded the paper and slipped it into her clutch, how Grant finally exhaled once it was done. Relief is loud when you know how to listen. When the ceremony ended, people stood and stretched, voices rising all at once. Congratulations floated through the air like confetti. Rachel passed Oliver to his godmother and turned to accept hugs, her smile now easy, unburdened. Grant shook hands, clapped shoulders, laughed a little too loudly. Not once did either of them look at me. I stayed where I was for a moment, letting the crowd move around me. There was a time in my life when I would have followed, would have tried to catch my daughter's eye, to share the moment, to pretend nothing was wrong. That instinct still stirred, out of habit more than hope. I let it pass. Eventually, Rachel approached me, Oliver back in her arms. "We're going to the restaurant," she said briskly. "You can come if you want. We'll talk later." Later. Always later. A word that meant never, or at least not honestly. "I'll follow in my own car," I said. She nodded, already half turned away. "Good." Grant gave me a polite smile then, the kind meant for distant relatives and neighbors you don't plan to invite twice. "Drive safe," he said. Outside, the air felt colder than it had an hour before. I stood on the church steps and watched people gather for photos, saw my grandson held up toward the pale winter sun. I memorized his face, the curve of his cheek, the faint crease between his brows that looked like Rachel's did when she was a baby and angry at the world. Whatever else happened, that face would remain mine to remember. The drive to the restaurant was short. I let a few cars pass me, not in a hurry. At a red light, I rested my hands on the steering wheel and studied them. These were the hands that had wiped Rachel's nose, buttoned her coats, signed her first school forms. The same hands had just signed something else entirely, and the difference mattered. The restaurant buzzed with noise and warmth. A long table had been set aside, white tablecloth, too many glasses per place. I took a seat near the end, not asked, not guided. Coats were draped, drinks poured. Conversation skimmed across safe surfaces, the weather, the baby, how quickly time goes. No one mentioned the paper. No one would. I ate little. I listened a lot. Grant spoke about investments, about how complicated things get as people age, about planning ahead. Each sentence was delivered casually, but I heard the edge underneath. Rachel laughed at his jokes, touching his arm, glancing at me only to check whether I was listening. I was. At one point, Rachel leaned over. "We'll go over everything soon," she said softly, for my ears alone. "This is for your own good. You know that, right?" I looked at her then, really looked, at the woman she had become, at the distance where closeness used to live. "I know exactly what it is," I said. She frowned, just for a second, then smoothed it away. Good. When lunch finally ended, chairs scraped back and people began to leave, full and satisfied. Hugs were exchanged, plans made. Grant paid the bill with a flourish. Rachel gathered her things. No one asked if I needed a ride. I walked to my car alone. The envelope for my grandson was still in my bag, untouched. I sat behind the wheel and didn't start the engine right away. I wasn't crying. That stage had passed years ago. What I felt was something colder and clearer, settling into place. They thought the signature was the end of it. They were wrong. I drove home slowly, not because I was unsteady, but because I wanted the time. At my age, you learn that rushing only steals moments you may need later. The road was familiar, every bend known by heart. I'd driven it in snowstorms, in grief, in joy. This drive felt different, quieter, as if something had finally settled instead of broken. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked the same as it had that morning. Pale siding, the old oak by the fence, the front window with the lace curtain I never replaced after it yellowed. No locks had changed. No lights were on. Nothing had shifted except the understanding of who thought they owned what. Inside, I took off my coat and hung it carefully, smoothing the sleeve as I always do. Small habits matter. They remind you that you still belong to yourself. I set my handbag on the kitchen table and finally opened it properly, not in a rush, not searching. I took out the envelope meant for my grandson and placed it beside the fruit bowl. Then I sat down. I replayed the moment of signing, not with regret, but with attention. I knew exactly what I had signed. I had not been confused. I had not been pressured beyond what I could bear. They believed age meant weakness. They confused restraint for ignorance. That mistake was theirs. After my husband died, I learned quickly that survival is mostly paperwork. Forms, deadlines, signatures. I learned to read every line, to ask questions no one expected me to ask, to keep copies of everything. Rachel knew this. Grant probably did too. But they also knew something else. That I avoided conflict. That I hated scenes. That I would rather swallow hurt than make noise. They mistook that for surrender. I went to the small desk by the window and opened the bottom drawer. Inside were folders, labeled in my handwriting. Insurance, deeds, accounts, correspondence. I pulled out the one marked property and laid it flat. The house deed was there, clean and clear, my name alone. I checked the date, the registration number. Still mine. A signature on a separate agreement does not magically rewrite public records. That is not how the world works, no matter how confidently someone smiles while telling you otherwise. Next, I took out my reading glasses and reread the document in my mind, clause by clause, effective upon processing, subject to review, power of attorney to be finalized. Words that sound decisive to people who don't know better. Words that require follow-up, confirmation, filing. Words that leave room, a lot of room. I made tea. The kettle whistled the way it always has, sharp and impatient. I poured the water, wrapped my hands around the cup, and felt the warmth steady me. I was not angry. Anger wastes energy. What I felt was resolve, calm and unadorned. My phone buzzed on the table. A message from Rachel. "We'll come by this week to go over next steps." No question mark. No, "Are you okay?" Just a statement, as if the matter were already settled. I didn't reply. Silence, too, can be a sentence. I thought about the years leading up to that morning, the subtle shifts, the way concern had turned into supervision, how offers of help had become expectations of access, how love had slowly been rewritten as entitlement. None of it had happened overnight. That's how these things work. They rely on your patience, your hope, your fear of being alone. I washed my cup and put it away. Then I sat back down and opened my calendar. Monday morning, I wrote. Bank. Tuesday. Notary. Wednesday. Lawyer. Simple words. Solid steps. They believed the paper was a leash. I knew better. It was a line they had crossed, not one they had secured. Outside, the light began to fade. I turned on the lamp by my chair and picked up a book, though I didn't read. I was thinking, measuring, planning, not in anger, not in revenge, but in clarity. They had asked me to sign or leave. I had signed. What they hadn't understood was this. I had never left myself. The next morning, I woke before my alarm, the way I always do when something important is waiting. The house was quiet, holding its breath with me. For a moment, lying there, I almost reached for the familiar comfort of denial, the old reflex to tell myself that yesterday had been unpleasant but manageable, that things would smooth themselves out if I stayed patient. I let that thought come, and I let it go. I got up, washed my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. Not critically, honestly. 72 years leave their marks whether you approve of them or not. Fine lines, silver hair, eyes that have seen too much to pretend anymore. What I saw wasn't a victim. It was a woman who had finally stopped negotiating her worth. I made breakfast the same way I always had. Toast, a boiled egg, tea. Routine has a way of anchoring you when other things feel uncertain. As I ate, I replayed the lunch in my mind. Not the words, but the glances. The way Grant spoke about my future as if I were an abstract problem. The way Rachel nodded along, relieved that someone else was doing the hard part for her. She hadn't always been like that. Or maybe she had, and I simply chose not to see it. My phone buzzed again while I was rinsing my plate. Another message from Rachel. "We need to move quickly. It's important we don't delay." Need, important, urgent. Words meant to push me off balance. I dried my hands carefully before picking up the phone. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned it face down and placed it in the drawer by the sink. Not out of spite, out of necessity. Late morning, I took out the trash and chatted briefly with my neighbor, Mrs. Collins. She commented on the weather, on how fast children grow. I nodded, smiled, exchanged the small talk that keeps the world running smoothly. She didn't know what had happened in the church. No one on my street did. And that was fine. This wasn't a story meant for public consumption. Back inside, I opened the folder from the desk again. This time, I wasn't just reviewing, I was preparing. I made a list in my notebook, the one I've kept for years. Dates, names, actions. There is comfort in lists. They don't argue with you. They don't raise their voices. They simply wait to be followed. Around noon, Grant called. I watched the phone vibrate across the table, patient and insistent. I let it ring out. A minute later, a voicemail arrived. His voice was calm, almost friendly, as if we were discussing a dinner reservation. He spoke about planning ahead, about responsibility, about how this is best for everyone. He didn't once ask how I was feeling. That told me everything I needed to know. I thought of the years I had spent softening my words so they wouldn't bruise others, of how often I had agreed just to keep the peace. Peace, I had learned, is a luxury you can't afford when it's built entirely on your silence. In the afternoon, I sat by the window with my notebook and wrote a single sentence at the top of the page. I am not confused. I underlined it once, not twice. Once was enough. The day passed without drama. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just clarity settling deeper with every hour. By evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. A steady certainty, quiet but immovable. They believed pressure would make me pliable. That age would make me grateful for any attention, even the wrong kind. They had mistaken familiarity for control. I turned my phone back on before bed. 3 missed calls. 2 messages. I read them without reacting, then set the phone on the nightstand. Tomorrow, I would start making my visits. Tomorrow, I would speak to people who dealt in facts, not family narratives. Tomorrow was close enough. I lay down, turned off the light, and rested my hands on my chest, listening to my own breathing. I was not afraid of what came next. For the first time in years, I was ready. Monday morning came without ceremony. No thunder, no revelation, just light through the curtains and the familiar ache in my knees when I swung my legs out of bed. I welcomed the normality of it. Important decisions don't always arrive with drama. Sometimes they come quietly, disguised as routine. I dressed simply, choosing comfort over appearance, though I made sure I looked neat. There is a difference between giving up and conserving strength. I took my folder from the desk, slipped it into my bag, and checked that I had my glasses, my notebook, and my house keys. Before leaving, I paused in the hallway and looked around. The framed photos, the worn runner on the floor, the faint smell of lemon cleaner. This house had witnessed my life without commentary. It deserved my loyalty. The bank was already busy when I arrived. Young people with headphones, middle-aged couples whispering over paperwork, an elderly man arguing gently with a teller about a fee he didn't understand. I took a number and sat down. Waiting has never bothered me. I waited years for my husband to come home from the hospital knowing he wouldn't. I could wait 20 minutes for a clerk. When my turn came, I was shown to a small desk by the window. The woman across from me introduced herself and smiled politely. She spoke slowly, the way people often do when they see gray hair. I let her finish. I need to review access to my accounts, I said. Specifically, who is authorized to act on my behalf. She nodded and began typing. The screen reflected faintly in her glasses. I see a pending request for power of attorney, she said after a moment. It hasn't been finalized yet. Good, I replied. That word, good, felt solid in my mouth. We went through everything carefully. Which accounts were solely mine? Which required signatures? Which actions had been requested but not completed? Nothing had moved yet. Paperwork has a way of pretending to be urgent while doing absolutely nothing unless someone makes it official. I would like to suspend all pending authorizations, I said, and limit access to myself only, effective immediately. She looked up at me, just slightly surprised. Of course. I'll need your signature. I signed. Again. But this time, the pen felt lighter. When I left the bank, the air outside felt sharper, cleaner. I sat in my car for a moment and wrote a note in my notebook. Bank, done. I underlined it. The notary's office was next, a small place tucked between a pharmacy and a dry cleaner. I'd been there before, years ago, when my husband and I updated our wills. The woman behind the desk recognized me, though she didn't say so. She reviewed the document Rachel had given me, adjusting her glasses as she read. "This is incomplete," she said finally, "and highly conditional." "I know," I answered. She explained what I already understood. Signatures without proper filing, without witnesses, without registration, are intentions at best. Leverage at worst, not ownership. I thanked her and left. By the time I got home, my phone had filled with messages. Rachel asking when we could talk. Grant suggesting we all sit down like adults. A missed call from an unfamiliar number I assumed was a lawyer they had already involved. I didn't respond. Instead, I made myself lunch and ate it at the kitchen table, unhurried. I thought about the word family, how often it's used to excuse behavior that wouldn't be tolerated from a stranger. How easily love turns into obligation when someone decides you owe them for the years you already gave. In the afternoon, I sat down and drafted a short list of boundaries. Not demands, not explanations, just facts. I didn't plan to send it yet. Some things are better delivered face-to-face with witnesses who don't blink. That evening, as the light faded, I felt tired but steady. Not drained, not shaken, just aware. They believed this process would overwhelm me, confuse me, scare me into compliance. What they hadn't considered was this. I had built a life from paperwork, patience, and quiet endurance. This was familiar ground, and I was no longer walking it for them. I slept deeply that night, the kind of sleep that comes after a decision has been made and accepted by the body before the mind catches up. When I woke, there was no heaviness on my chest, no urge to check my phone for damage control, just the steady awareness of what the day required. Tuesday was for the notary and the lawyer, people who dealt in facts, signatures, and consequences, people who didn't soften their words to protect feelings. I chose a dark blue cardigan and low shoes, the kind I could walk in without thinking. Before leaving, I locked the house carefully, testing the door once, then twice. Not out of fear, out of habit. Ownership is also a habit, and I intended to keep it. The law office was quiet, almost reverent. The walls held framed diplomas and photographs of people shaking hands over closed deals. I had been there before, years earlier, after my husband died. Back then, I had sat in the same chair with trembling hands, terrified of missing something important. Today, my hands were steady. The lawyer greeted me politely, a man younger than my daughter, with tired eyes and a practiced calm. He asked what brought me in. I handed him the document without commentary and waited while he read. His eyebrows lifted slightly. That was all. No gasp, no outrage. Professionals rarely dramatize. "This would have transferred significant control," he said finally, "if completed." "If," I repeated. "Yes." He folded the paper and set it aside. "You're not legally obligated to proceed, and you're well within your rights to revoke any informal consent." I nodded. "I want everything documented, cleanly." We talked through options, protective clauses, clear boundaries, updated wills. safeguards that didn't rely on trust alone. I listened carefully, asked questions, took notes. The language was dry, precise, and deeply comforting. At one point, he looked at me and said, "You're doing the right thing." I didn't need reassurance, but I accepted it anyway. Some truths are easier to hear from someone who has no emotional stake. By the time I left, my bag was heavier with papers and lighter with doubt. I sat in my car for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the quiet settle. I wasn't cutting anyone out of my life. I was cutting out their ability to corner me. My phone rang as I pulled out of the parking lot. Rachel's name flashed on the screen. I didn't answer. Not yet. Timing matters. Silence, used correctly, speaks more clearly than argument. At home, I made tea and reviewed my notes. Everything was clear. Nothing rushed, no hidden traps, just process. In the afternoon, Grant sent a long message. Polite, concerned, slightly patronizing. He wrote about stress, misunderstandings, how families sometimes stumble but must stick together. He ended by suggesting we meet soon, before things get complicated. I read it once, then again. Then I placed the phone face down. Things were already complicated, just not for me. As evening came, I stood by the window and watched the streetlights come on, one by one. Somewhere, Rachel and Grant were likely talking, recalculating, wondering why I wasn't reacting the way they expected. They had counted on urgency, confusion, fear. They hadn't counted on patience. I felt no triumph, no bitterness, only a quiet certainty that something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer responding to their moves. I was making my own. Tomorrow would bring conversation, maybe confrontation, maybe regret on their part. But tonight, I was exactly where I needed to be. The call finally came the next morning, earlier than I expected. Grant's name lit up the screen while I was buttering toast. I let it ring twice before answering, not to make a point, but because I refused to be trained like a dog to jump at every sound. "Good morning," I said. There was a brief pause, the kind people use to adjust their tone. "Good morning," he replied. "I hope I'm not calling too early." "You are," I said calmly, and waited. He cleared his throat. "We need to talk. Rachel's very upset. She feels like you're shutting her out." I took my plate to the table and sat down. "That's an interesting way to describe what's happening." "We're just concerned," he continued, "about you, about making sure everything is in order while it's still easy." "Easy for whom?" I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. He shifted tactics. I could hear it in his voice. "No one wants conflict. We thought the agreement was a reasonable solution. You signed it willingly. I signed it quietly," I corrected. "Not blindly." He laughed softly, as if I'd made a joke. "Of course. But you have to understand how this looks now. You're sending mixed signals." I set my fork down. "No, Grant. I'm sending very clear ones. You just don't like the message." His tone cooled. "Rachel is your daughter." "Yes," I said. "And I am her mother, not her asset." He exhaled through his nose. "You're being emotional." That word. It always arrives when someone realizes they're losing control. "I'm being precise," I replied. "There's a difference." He started to say something else, then stopped himself. I imagined him glancing at Rachel, covering the phone, recalculating. Finally, he said, "We should meet, all of us. Get this back on track." "Back on which track?" I asked. "The one where decisions are made for me without my consent?" Silence. I will meet with Rachel, I continued. Alone, when I'm ready. Until then, all communication about my finances goes through my lawyer. His voice hardened. You didn't need to involve a lawyer. I didn't need to be handed an ultimatum in a church, I said. That landed. I could tell by the way he stopped breathing for a second. This doesn't have to get ugly, he said quietly. It won't, I replied. Not if you behave. He ended the call soon after, without pleasantries. I didn't feel shaken. I felt confirmed. Later that afternoon, Rachel came by unannounced. I saw her car through the window and felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the old reflex to brace, to smooth, to prepare excuses. I stayed seated until she rang the bell. When I opened the door, she looked smaller than she had in the church. No makeup, hair pulled back too tight, anger and fear fighting for space on her face. How could you do this? She said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I closed the door behind her. Sit down, I said. Not loudly, not angrily. She didn't. You're making everything so difficult. I met her eyes. You made it difficult when you tried to corner me. I'm just refusing to stay there. She crossed her arms. We were trying to help you. No, I said. You were trying to help yourselves and calling it care. Her mouth opened, then closed. Tears came quickly after that. Real ones, I think, or close enough. I'm scared, she said. I don't want to lose you. I softened my voice, but not my position. Then don't treat me like something you can sign over. She sank into the chair at last, shoulders slumping. For the first time, she looked at me instead of through me. I stood there, watching her breathe, and understood something clearly. This wasn't the end of our relationship, but it was the end of the version where I was silent, compliant, and convenient. And that was not a loss. That evening, after Rachel left, the house felt unusually still. Not empty, just settled, like dust after something heavy has been moved. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I've learned that silence, when chosen, can be restorative instead of cruel. I made soup and ate it slowly, standing by the counter. My appetite was modest, but steady. That mattered to me. Big emotions used to steal my hunger. This time they didn't. It felt like proof of something. Later my phone rang again. A different name this time. My grandson. I sat down before answering, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to be fully present. Grandma, he said, a little hesitant. Mom said you talked. We did, I replied. Are you all right? There was a pause, then a small exhale. I think so. She's stressed. I imagine, I said gently. I didn't ask questions. I didn't correct him. Children, no matter their age, shouldn't be drafted into adult conflicts. I just wanted to hear your voice, he continued, and to tell you, I love you. Something in my chest loosened then, not dramatically, just enough to breathe easier. I love you too, I said. That hasn't changed. It won't. He hesitated. Are you mad? No, I answered honestly. I'm clear. There's a difference. He laughed softly, relieved. We spoke a few more minutes about nothing important. His work, the weather, a book he was reading. Ordinary things. When we hung up, I sat for a while with the phone in my hand, grateful for that small, unburdened connection. The next day passed quietly. No visits, no calls. I took a walk around the block, slower than I used to, but steady. The trees were already hinting at change, leaves thinning, light filtering through differently. Seasons don't ask permission. They arrive when they're ready. In the afternoon, I received an email from my lawyer confirming that everything we discussed was now in motion. Clear documentation, firm boundaries, no loopholes. I read it twice, then filed it away. For the first time since the christening, I thought back to the moment in the church without flinching. I saw myself there again, standing in the aisle, paper in my hand. I hadn't looked small. I hadn't looked lost. I had looked exactly like who I was, a woman confronted with a choice, choosing not to collapse. That mattered. Rachel texted that evening, short, careful. I need some time, but I hope we can talk again. I replied just as carefully, we will. When respect is part of the conversation. I set the phone aside and turned on the lamp by my chair. The light filled the room softly, no harsh edges. I picked up my book and read a few pages, actually read them this time. The words stayed with me instead of sliding off. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't grieving. I was adjusting to a new balance, one that didn't require me to shrink so others could feel tall. Whatever came next would come on honest terms, or not at all. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. The days that followed settled into a strange, careful rhythm, not peaceful, but quieter than before, like a house after an argument where the furniture hasn't moved yet, but everyone knows it might. I woke each morning without dread, though I still woke early. Old habits don't disappear just because the reason for them has changed. Rachel didn't call. Grant didn't try again. That silence was deliberate, I knew. They were waiting for me to blink, to soften, to come chasing reassurance the way I always had. I didn't. I watered my plants, paid my bills, read the paper cover to cover. I lived inside my own hours instead of theirs. On the third day, I received an email from a legal office I didn't recognize. Polite, formal, carefully neutral. It stated that they represented Rachel and Grant and wished to clarify intentions regarding recent misunderstandings. No accusations, no warmth, just pressure wrapped in manners. I forwarded it to my lawyer without comment and closed my laptop. I was done responding directly to narratives designed to corner me. That afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table and sorted through old documents I hadn't touched in years, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to remember. Deeds, receipts, tax forms, handwritten notes from my husband reminding himself to fix the fence or call the plumber. Our life reduced to paper, built slowly, honestly. Nothing about it had been easy, but it had been ours. That mattered more now than it ever had. I thought about motherhood, about how no one tells you that loving a child doesn't end when they grow up. But the power you have does. Somewhere along the way, care gets mistaken for access, history for entitlement. You don't notice it at first because it happens politely, one small step at a time. By the time you feel crowded, you're already backed into a corner. That evening, my grandson called again. Not nervous this time, just tired. "They're arguing," he said quietly. "A lot." "I'm sorry to hear that," I answered, and meant it without guilt. He hesitated, then said, "Mom keeps saying she did what she thought was best." "I believe that," I replied. "People often do." He didn't ask me to fix it. That was new. Instead, he told me about work, about plans he was unsure of, about ordinary things that didn't require loyalty tests. When we hung up, I felt something close to pride. Not in myself, but in him. He was learning something I had learned too late. The next morning, I received a message from Rachel. Longer this time. Defensive, then emotional, then careful again. She wrote about fear, about responsibility, about how overwhelmed she felt becoming a mother. She didn't apologize. She didn't accuse me either. It was the first honest thing she had sent in years. I read it twice and didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't care, but because I did. Some conversations deserve space before they begin. By nightfall, I stood by the window and watched the street grow dark. I realized then that I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for forgiveness, not for permission, not for them to understand. Whatever happened next would unfold without me shrinking to make it easier. And that, I knew, was the point. By the end of the week, everything that needed to be put in writing had been put there. Not dramatically, not loudly, just clearly. My lawyer called in the morning to confirm that formal notices had been sent and that any previous assumptions about access or authority were now officially void. His tone was neutral, professional, almost bored. I liked that. It meant things were proceeding as they should. I thanked him and hung up, then sat at the kitchen table for a long moment without moving. I wasn't bracing myself. I was listening inward, checking whether fear had returned. It hadn't. There was only a steady awareness that something irreversible had happened, and that it had happened because I chose it. The official letter arrived that afternoon, delivered like any other piece of mail. White envelope. My name typed neatly on the front. No sense of ceremony at all. I opened it carefully and read through the language I already knew by heart. It outlined boundaries, revoked assumptions, and made it clear that any further steps would require my explicit consent. No emotion, just structure. I imagined Rachel opening her copy. I imagined Grant reading it twice, once quickly and once more slowly, searching for weaknesses. I didn't feel satisfaction at the thought. Only a quiet finality. That evening, Rachel called. Her voice sounded different, less sharp, less certain. "I got the letter," she said. "Yes," I replied. There was silence on the line, then a sigh she didn't bother to hide. "You didn't have to make it so formal." "I did," I said. "That's what you brought into the church with you." "Formality." She flinched audibly. That wasn't fair. "No," I agreed. It wasn't. Another pause. This one heavier. I could hear her breathing, uneven now. "I didn't think it would go this far." "That's usually the problem," I said gently. "People don't think past the moment they want something." Her voice cracked. "I was scared. About the baby, about money, about you getting older." I closed my eyes briefly, not to retreat, but to steady myself. Being scared doesn't give you the right to corner me, or to treat my life like a contingency plan. "I know," she whispered. That was new. Not an excuse, not a defense, just acknowledgement. We talked longer than I expected. Not about documents or lawyers, but about distance, about when things started to shift, about how easily care turns into control if no one stops it early. She cried. I didn't. That too was new. When the call ended, I didn't feel repaired. I felt honest. There is a difference. Later that night, I sat alone in the living room with only one lamp on. The house felt solid around me, not because it was protected by law, but because it was protected by clarity. I thought about the woman I had been even a month ago, swallowing discomfort to keep things smooth, telling myself that silence was kindness. I understood now that silence, when it costs you your dignity, is not kindness at all. Whatever the future held with my daughter would have to be built differently, slower, with limits, with respect that didn't depend on my compliance. I turned off the light and went to bed, knowing that, for the first time in years, nothing essential was slipping through my fingers. The following morning, I woke to the muted light of winter filtering through the curtains. The house was still, holding the quiet like it had absorbed every moment from the days before. I sat at the edge of the bed for a few minutes, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of decisions I had made settle around me. There was no fear, no urgency, only a careful, steady awareness that the boundaries I had drawn were now real and irreversible. I dressed methodically, choosing clothes that were comfortable and practical, but neat enough to remind myself that I still mattered in a world that had once tried to tell me otherwise. I made tea, letting the aroma fill the kitchen, and then sat at the table with my folder of documents and my notebook. I reviewed each paper carefully, not because I doubted them, but because attention to detail had always been my way of controlling what I could. Life doesn't give you much control over people, but you can always control your own response. Mid-morning, my phone rang. Rachel's name flashed across the screen. I didn't answer immediately. I let it ring twice and then picked up, my voice calm, neutral. "Good morning." "Mom," she said, voice quieter than it had been the day before. Hesitation? She paused. I wanted to check in, about everything." I sipped my tea before speaking. "I assume you mean the documents and boundaries. Everything is in place." "Yes," she admitted. "I read them." I didn't expect it to be so final." "Nothing here is negotiable," I said gently, "because everything here is factual. I signed nothing blindly, and I expected the same from you." There was silence on the line, long enough for both of us to absorb what that meant. I imagined her hands tightening around her phone, her heartbeat rising with the realization that I had crossed an invisible line she thought I never would. I had, but not recklessly, not in anger. I had acted with clarity and restraint. "I know I misstepped," she said finally. "I tried to protect you in my way, but I see now. I was wrong." I didn't interrupt. Let her finish. There is a kind of power in listening quietly while someone finally admits what you already knew. "Acknowledgement is different from compliance," I said. "I have lived long enough to understand the difference." Her voice trembled. I am sorry. I didn't think about what I was asking. I thought it was easier if you agreed." "It's never easier when someone else assumes control," I replied. "Not for me. Not for any of us." We spoke then, cautiously, about what had happened, without raising voices, without pleading or threats. She admitted fear, frustration, and guilt. I explained calmly what had compelled my actions, why boundaries were necessary, and how I would continue to protect my own life without hostility, but without compromise. After the call ended, I set the phone aside and walked to the window, looking at the street below. The light was pale and still, the way it is in winter afternoons, reflective and honest. I realized I no longer needed to fear her or Grant's impatience. The confrontation had already occurred, but not with shouting, not with bitterness. It had occurred with quiet assertion, with clarity, and deliberate choice. Later, I made a pot of tea and returned to my chair by the window. The house, the documents, the decisions, they all aligned with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The phone remained silent. For once, Silence was a friend rather than an alarm. I considered the woman I had been before the christening, the one who would have swallowed her discomfort to preserve appearances. That woman no longer existed in this house. I had chosen differently, and that choice had transformed the air around me. By evening, I wrote in my notebook, "Boundaries are not betrayal. Respect is not optional." I read the words aloud softly, as if testing them in the room. The sound felt right, firm, just. I turned off the lamp, feeling the house settle around me, knowing the next steps, the eventual reconciliations, would be measured by honesty rather than fear. And for the first time in decades, I felt unshakable in my own truth. The morning arrived softly, with light spilling across the floorboards and settling on familiar surfaces that had witnessed decades of my life. I moved through the house with quiet purpose, making tea and preparing breakfast in a way that felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. Each motion was measured, each action a reminder that this space belonged entirely to me, that the life within it was under my care alone. The documents were stacked neatly on the desk, their significance already absorbed, but I reviewed them once more, not out of doubt, but as affirmation. Clarity has a weight, and sometimes it must be handled carefully. By mid-morning, I took a slow walk around the neighborhood. The streets were empty, save for a few dogs being led on leashes and a newspaper slipping across a lawn in the wind. My steps were steady, my breath visible in the crisp air. Each familiar turn, each detail, the lamppost bent slightly, the sidewalk cracked near the curb, served as markers of permanence. Change had arrived in our lives, but not in the world itself. The world remained constant, indifferent to disputes and grievances. There was a strange comfort in that. When I returned, a letter had been left at the door, hand-delivered, addressed in neat, unfamiliar script. I carried it inside with calm hands and sat at the table, turning the envelope slowly before opening it. The contents were formal, clear, and precise. Legal confirmation that the boundaries I had set were now fully recognized, that no assumptions could override the decisions I had made. There was no triumph in the words, no satisfaction, only finality. And I understood, with an even deeper certainty than before, that control had shifted back to where it belonged. That afternoon, Rachel called. Her tone was hesitant, careful, searching for something she didn't know how to articulate. I let her speak without interruption. She talked about fear, frustration, the weight of expectations, the guilt she carried for her own choices. She admitted uncertainty, confessed mistakes she had tried to rationalize over the weeks since the christening. I listened, responding only when necessary, calmly and without judgment. The exchange was not dramatic, but it was honest. For the first time, she saw that acknowledgement and compliance are not the same, and I was willing to let her discover the distinction without coercion. After the conversation, I sat quietly, drinking tea, feeling the warmth seep into my hands. I watched the afternoon fade, sunlight dimming into muted gray as winter drew near. There was a satisfaction in routine, in the quiet order I had created around myself. No one could dictate my life while I remained attentive to my own choices. That lesson, hard-earned over decades, was now reinforced in a way that required no further words. My decisions, my house, my time, all were protected by clear intention. Evening came, and I sat by the window with my notebook, reviewing notes, lists, and reminders of past correspondence. The room was peaceful, filled only with the quiet hum of the heating system and the occasional distant sound from the street. I considered the past weeks with clarity, understanding where patience had been mistaken for weakness, where generosity had been interpreted as unlimited access. I realized that restraint is a tool and discretion is often stronger than confrontation. I closed the notebook, setting it aside, and allowed the stillness of the house to settle over me. By the time I went to bed, I felt a sense of equilibrium I hadn't known for years. The future with Rachel and Grant would unfold, but it would do so under new terms, ones that honored respect and honesty over entitlement and assumption. I lay down, hands resting lightly on the blanket, and felt a quiet, unshakable certainty. My life was mine to govern, my dignity intact, and the knowledge of that alone provided a serenity that no ultimatum, no letter, and no expectation could diminish. The morning arrived quietly, with pale sunlight stretching across the floorboards and illuminating the familiar corners of my home. I made tea and moved slowly through the routine that had become my anchor. The kettle boiling, the aroma of leaves filling the kitchen, the careful placement of my cup on the table. Each motion reminded me that the life within these walls belonged to me alone, that I could govern my day without interruption or coercion. There was a solidity to the quiet that had not existed before, a certainty that came from clear, deliberate choice. Rachel called mid-morning. I answered after a brief pause, steady and calm. She spoke first, hesitant, acknowledging the letter I had received. Her voice trembled, carrying a mixture of relief and guilt. I understand what you've done, she said. I see it now. I see the boundaries. I let her speak, listening without interruption. There was no need to defend, no need to justify. The facts were present, the lines drawn, and acknowledgement alone was sufficient for this conversation to have meaning. We talked for a long while, carefully. She admitted mistakes she had made in how she had treated me over the years, recognizing where fear and frustration had shaped her actions. I responded calmly, clearly, without letting emotion dictate the flow. I explained the importance of respect and autonomy, of understanding that care cannot demand ownership. She listened, really listened, in a way she had not before. That was the difference, the first step toward a more honest relationship. After the call, I returned to my chair by the window, looking out at the street below. The light had shifted, softening against the bare trees and long shadows. I thought of the years I had lived quietly, accommodating the expectations of others to avoid conflict, swallowing discomfort so that others might feel safe. That woman had done her best, but she had not been free. I was free now, not triumphant, not vindictive, simply unshackled, with clarity and calm guiding my steps. The afternoon passed in ordinary ways, but with an extraordinary awareness. I reviewed my notes, checked the documents once more, and made small plans for the coming week, knowing that each decision would now be guided by my own priorities and not by the assumed demands of others. Silence in the house was no longer oppressive, it was restorative. Each sound, the kettle, the rustle of paper, the occasional bird outside, reinforced the rhythm I had chosen, a rhythm of agency and awareness. Evening fell, bringing long shadows and quiet reflection. I sat by the lamp, my notebook open, and wrote down thoughts that had formed over the past weeks. Observations about fairness, responsibility, and the distinction between respect and expectation. I read each line, considering the clarity they provided. The past could not be erased, but the future could be navigated deliberately. I closed the notebook, satisfied that my course was defined, deliberate, and self-respecting. Before bed, I walked through the house, touching familiar surfaces, noticing small details. the picture frames, the soft rug under my feet, the faint scent of tea lingering in the kitchen. These were markers of a life fully my own. As I prepared for sleep, I felt a quiet steadiness, a deep, unshakable certainty that my decisions had restored a balance that had long been absent. Tomorrow, and every day after, would be guided not by fear, not by obligation, but by the clear understanding of my own value, and that knowledge was enough to bring a profound peace that had been missing for decades. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. I moved deliberately, preparing tea and toast, following the routines that had always grounded me. Each action felt purposeful, an affirmation that I controlled my own space, my own choices, and my own time. Over the past weeks, boundaries had been tested, documents had been signed and reviewed, conversations had been held with care and restraint, and now there was a profound calm in the regularity of these ordinary moments. I spent the morning reading, a novel long set aside, letting the words fill the quiet spaces of the house. The events of the past weeks replayed in my mind, not with pain, but with measured awareness. I remembered the christening, the paper in my hand, the tension, the calm deliberation I had summoned. I recalled Rachel's and Grant's faces, the expressions that had betrayed expectations they had assumed would not be questioned. The memories were no longer sharp with frustration, but tempered by understanding and resolve. I had acted not out of impulse, but from a position of self-respect and clarity. By late morning, I felt a need to step outside. The air was crisp and carried the faint scent of frost on the grass. I walked slowly down the familiar paths of my neighborhood, each step deliberate. The quiet streets were nearly empty, a few neighbors moving in the distance, dogs trotting beside their owners. I observed the details that often go unnoticed: the tilt of the lampposts, the cracks in the sidewalks, the subtle shift in light as clouds moved overhead. Life continued, indifferent to conflicts and demands. The constancy of the world offered reassurance. Some things remain beyond the reach of contention, steady and reliable. Returning home, I found a message from Rachel on my phone. She was tentative, careful, the words thoughtful and restrained. She spoke about reflection, about recognition of missteps, about understanding the necessity of boundaries. I read her message more than once, appreciating the honesty without feeling the need to respond immediately. The acknowledgement itself carried weight. Silence could be as meaningful as words when the intention behind it is deliberate. I set the phone aside and resumed tending to the house, allowing the rhythm of small tasks to reinforce my sense of agency. The afternoon passed in quiet diligence. I organized papers, prepared meals, and reviewed my notes, each action a conscious affirmation of self-reliance. The past weeks had made it clear that respect must be actively maintained. It cannot be assumed or taken for granted. Generosity and care are not synonymous with obligation, and I had reclaimed the understanding of that truth for myself. The stability I felt was neither fragile nor temporary. It was grounded in recognition of my own value and in the deliberate structuring of my life around that principle. Evening approached, soft and steady, and I prepared for bed with the same intentionality I had applied to the day. I reviewed the plans for the coming days, aware that interactions with Rachel and Grant would unfold under new terms defined by honesty and respect, rather than assumption or coercion. I felt no need for triumph, no urge for retribution, only a quiet certainty that the choices I had made were measured and right. Lying in bed, the house around me calm and orderly, I understood that the days ahead would be met with composure and clarity. My life, once negotiated by the expectations of others, was now wholly my own. The last morning of that week arrived without wait. I woke to pale light and lay still for a moment, listening to the house breathe the way it always had. Pipes settling, the faint hum of electricity, the quiet reassurance of a place that knows you. At my age, peace doesn't come from excitement. It comes from alignment. And for the first time in a long while, my thoughts, my actions, and my boundaries were no longer arguing with each other. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around the cup, feeling the warmth travel slowly into my fingers. There were no urgent messages waiting, no requests disguised as concern, no need to explain myself. That absence wasn't loneliness. It was space. And space, I had learned, is where dignity has room to stand. Rachel called later that morning. Not to negotiate, not to demand, just to talk. Her voice was steadier than it had been weeks ago, stripped of urgency. We spoke about ordinary things, the baby's sleepless nights, the weather, plans that didn't require my permission or my signature. When the conversation drifted toward the past, she stopped herself and said quietly, "I know things can't go back to how they were." "No," I answered, "but they can go forward, honestly." She agreed. That was enough for now. After the call, I walked through the house slowly, noticing details I had overlooked for years. The small crack in the hallway wall that never spread. The chair by the window where I had read so many evenings in silence. These things had remained constant while people changed. They reminded me that stability doesn't come from others' approval. It comes from self-respect, practiced daily, quietly, without witnesses. In the afternoon, my grandson stopped by. He hugged me without asking permission, sat at the table, drank tea, talked about his plans. No tension, no explanations required. When he left, he smiled and said, "You seem lighter." I was. As evening settled in, I sat by the lamp and thought about the woman I had been for most of my life, the one who believed love meant endurance, that keeping the peace was a moral duty, even when it cost her voice. That woman had survived, but she had not always lived freely. I didn't resent her. She did what she knew how to do. But I no longer needed to be her. Age had not weakened me. It had clarified me. It had taught me that saying no is not cruelty, that boundaries are not punishment, and that love without respect is not love at all. I wrote one final line in my notebook and closed it gently. I did not raise my child to own me. Before bed, I stood at the window and watched the streetlights glow against the dark. My life was quieter now, but it was honest. No ultimatums, no fear, just choice. If you are reading this and recognize yourself in any part of my story, hear this from someone who learned it late, but learned it well. You are allowed to protect your dignity, no matter your age, no matter your role. And if this story spoke to you, don't keep it to yourself. Say something. Share it. Sometimes another woman needs to know she's not alone before she finds her own voice.